to the middle of nowhere. It's peaceful, nobody around, certainly quiet. I could probably yell and scream and no one would hear me. But it's probably the worst place to put my marketing content if I hoped anybody would see it. But wait a minute, is it? When we think about creating content that reaches people, we naturally want to put it in places where the most people will see it. And certainly if I put up a billboard here, everyone who came here would notice it. But who is that? And how many is everyone? And over what time frame? And would it be the right audience? It's kind of like that paraphrase of the age-old question, if I make marketing and no one sees it, did I actually say anything at all? And unfortunately, that means while this might be the place where my message would stand out the most, this is where most marketing winds up. It's kind of ironic, actually. As marketers, we want to put our message, our content, in a place where we are sure that people will notice it. But we also want to have the best chance that a lot of the right people will notice it over the shortest available time frame. And unfortunately, that usually means we have to focus our media strategy on the busiest of places, where we have to fight with every other marketer who wants exactly the same thing. It's called media planning. And it's the heart of every great marketing strategy.
So whether I'm trying to get my media out in some big, wide open space, or whether I'm trying to compete in some busy, noisy marketplace, this is the question. How do I get my message to the right person at the right time in the right way? Welcome to the Las Virgenes Open Space Preserve. And it's open here, I gotta tell you, there's nobody around. And this is episode 2 of Marketing Makers, the show that's built for helping marketers make marketing work. That's right, I don't care whether you're a Fortune 500 CEO or a sole practitioner or somewhere in between, we could all use a classic lesson of how wonderful old marketing techniques are still used and evolved in today's marketing approaches. So, today we're talking about media planning and specifically, how do we start working when we have become the media? Social media, media channels, owned media, shared media, earned media. It's all a big confusing mess. But I think some of the classic terms that we've come to play with media planning can still help us. And if we approach it in a new way, can really bring us marketing success. And we'll talk to one of the best practitioners I know in terms of brand, media, and making modern media planning work in today's marketplace. All right, well, to get started, I've got to get out of here. I've got to get out of this open space and get back to the Marketing Makers Lab. Welcome to Marketing Makers.
Oh, hi everybody. Welcome to the Marketing Makers Lab. I'm just trying to figure out some remote controls here. This is the Marketing Makers Lab, of course, where we explore in depth the background behind some of marketing's historical concepts and how they've evolved into some of today's most modern of approaches. And today, well, you can see I'm trying to figure out my remote control situation. Now, the thing is, I'm old enough to remember when I was the remote control for the television. You know, I would lie in front of the TV and my dad would say, try channel 5 or try NBC. And I'd switch the channel for him. There were basically 4 or 5 options in total. You had the broadcast networks, of course, ABC, CBS, and NBC. And then we had a couple of local stations way up there, channel 13, channel 28, I think it was. Anyway, it seemed like the higher you went, the worse it would come in over the airwaves. And those were also just the days, by the way, where you'd leave one TV network on all night. If you can believe it, audiences were much more network loyal then. And they'd even identify as such. Oh, I'm an NBC person or I'm an ABC person. And today, Well, today I'm trying to figure out how I ended up with three remotes. I mean, I've got one that controls my direct TV and the 740 channels it provides. And I've got another that controls my television itself, but still gives me access to 30 to 50 other services like Netflix and Disney Plus and Apple TV and HBO Max and others. And then I've got another one that controls my Apple TV device and it gives me access to a few other networks and, of course, my music library and all. I mean, it's a lot. Okay. So before you start writing into me and sending me letters about how to combine all these, I know that's what I was reading the manual to do. I still haven't figured out how to get it below at least two. And that gets me to where we are with marketing and planning for our business's media strategy. So, how did all that begin anyway? Well, it all starts and goes back to 1840. And there was a guy by the name of Volney D. Palmer, which is about as 1840 a name as you can possibly have. Anyway, he lives in Philadelphia and he noticed this market opportunity. He hypothesized that he could buy up large amounts of space in various newspapers at bulk and at a discounted price, of course. And then he could resell at a premium the space to companies that wanted to advertise in those newspapers. Now, the company would still handle all the design and the content creation for those ads, but Volney would basically be in the real estate business. And guess what? It worked. Yeah, Volney Palmer is largely credited with creating the first advertising media agency. But things changed very quickly. Less than 30 years later, a guy by the name of Francis Ayer founded an agency called the N.W. Ayer and Son Agency. And they started doing what was more common in those days, which was focused on creating slogans and content designed and ads for the advertisers themselves. Well, they acquired Palmer's media agency and they started to do both. They would not only help create all the content for those advertisers, they would help those advertisers place it in just the right newspapers. Now, you might remember some of their best work, such as When It Rains, It Pours. That was a campaign slogan for Morton Salt back in 1912. Or A Diamond is Forever. That was the slogan for De Beers Diamonds, created in 1947. And maybe the most famous of all was Be All You Can Be, created for the U.S. Army in 1981. Yeah, they really lasted that long. N.W. Ayer and Son only went out of business in 2002. But it is that late 90s and early 2000s that marks an incredibly important milestone in the discussion of media and marketing strategy. From the time that Ayer and Palmer first came together to combine the idea of content creation and the strategic placement of that content on media channels back in the 1800s, this is the standard way. It was standard operating procedure for marketing planning operations for the next 100 years. If you ever watch the show Mad Men, you'll have a new appreciation for how agencies and those companies combined the concepts of media planning and creative throughout the invention of all the mass media like radio and television and cable television and satellite television. But in the mid 1990s, there was a huge disruption. A new trend started to split the media planning strategy of where to put our content and the creative strategy of what content we should actually be creating. In the ad agency world, this is often referred to as the Great Unbundling of the late 1990s. Small planning agencies began to grow, big planning agencies began to thrive, and it would all culminate in the giant global agencies separating out, even if they were same part of the gigantic holding company, the functions of media planning and creative development. They were considered very separate categories. But why? Why did this happen? Well, as it turns out, the internet and the media channels there began to expand exponentially. It got, well, a lot harder to do media planning. You see, back in the time when I was the remote control for my dad, media planners had to plan for print, radio, and television. That was kind of it. The only places you could put your content to get attention from an audience. I mean, sure, there was billboards and there was some targeting, but it was mass targeting and mass audiences scale. And so agencies would simply charge clients a percentage of the total purchase of the placement of those various media. And as part of that service, they would give away the creative services and the strategy. Seems weird today, but it was the way it was. But now, as the 2000s approached and the late 90s sort of ended, well, there was not only 100 new cable TV networks with content for ever smaller niche audiences, But now there's websites and email and search results and mobile phones and social media. And it was not only exponentially more complex to do media planning, but because these channels were different, the numbers and types of creative pieces needed to be produced, well, that changed as well. So, as you might expect, marketers wanted better media planning and great breakthrough creative. They wanted both of those things and began to expect that agencies couldn't actually deliver it all as effectively as they might promise to. And the agencies, well, they wanted to make sure they were getting paid for all this amazing new different kinds of creative content they were creating for all these different channels. They didn't want to tie it to all of the complexity and difficulty that the new media planning landscape brought about. So, for all of these reasons, it was split up. You could hire two agencies or even develop an in-house team for media planning or creative development or even both. But okay, so what does that have to do with any of us today? What does that mean for us today? Well, the core of traditional media planning hasn't changed. We still need to balance it with standing out in the middle of nowhere versus trying to stand out in the middle of a busy media channel. Even in 2021, great media planning is still all about understanding which media channel gives us the best opportunity to deliver the right message to the right person at the right time so that enough of them take an action that we desire at a cost that makes sense for our business goals. That's the whole picture. So, what does it mean? Well, it means that we really have to understand the foundation of media planning because then we will be able to clearly see how it's fundamentally shifted into today's modern media planning, social media marketing, the use of owned media as part of our strategy. So, where does it begin? Where can we begin? Well, it all starts with some classic media planning terms that we still use to this day and which are important for us to understand as marketing makers. As I just mentioned, media planning as a concept hasn't changed. It's still the process where, through experience, research, or quite frankly, gut instinct in many cases, us marketing makers decide when and how often content needs to be placed on certain media channels in order to provide sufficient value for our business. Put very simply, we're trying to reach our target audience. We might buy our way into a target audience, such as in the case of advertising. We might try to earn our way onto a media channel, such as in the case of public relations or organic social media. Or we might try to attract them to our own media properties. But in order to figure out which of these you should do and how much effort you should look at, well, we got to look at a few factors that might use to judge where we're going to put all that content. So let's look at a couple of these. So the first one is, of course, flight dates. If someone asks, what are the flight dates? Well, these are simply the dates that you'll measure. It's a date where we start when our content is going to go live to an audience and an end date when we'll assess the overall effectiveness of that content. So for example, you might look at a month as a flight. And then you'll want to look at, of course, impressions or the total number of potential views you'll get to your content during that flight. Now, you may look at the total cost of those impressions. Now, because impressions are usually very large numbers in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands or even millions these days in mass media, the cost of impressions are usually expressed in what we call CPM, or cost per thousand. So, for example, if the media platform promises you 100,000 impressions, meaning how many times your content will be seen in a certain time flight, and the quoted cost is, say, $10,000, it means that you have a CPM of $100. 10,000 times $100 per thousand equals 100,000. Then you'll also want to look at what's called net reach. Now, that's different than impressions because it's the number total of people, just individual people that saw your content. Now, this is important because, yeah, it's interesting to know the total number of impressions, but don't assume all those impressions are coming from different people. If the same wrong person views your ad or your content 200 times, well, it's still a waste of money. Knowing the net reach of the platform helps you on understanding the frequency or how many times your content could possibly be seen by the same person. For example, Let's say we're guaranteed 100,000 impressions in a 1 month flight and a net reach of 40%. Well, that means that you're being promised that at least 40,000 of those 100,000 impressions will be a unique person. That means in a perfectly symmetrical world, and let's be honest, it's never perfectly symmetrical. Well, then obviously, with 100,000 impressions over 1 month on this platform, 40,000 unique people will see it, and each of those people would theoretically see it 2.5 times. Now, to be clear, there are obvious differences in value between an ad that would be repeated across a website or during the day on TV, how many times people see it, and an article or a show or other type of content that once you read it, you don't need to be continuously seeing it over and over and over again. So while higher net reach is always a good thing, not all repeat impressions are created equally. So as we move more into digital media, of course, we want to look at other things. We want to look at CTR or click-through rate. This is the average percentage of people who actually will take an action and click through to whatever it is you're calling them to do on your digital content. This may also be simply called a conversion rate if they're going to fill out a form or in some way have to do things just beyond clicking. And of course, when it comes to social media, we may have things like shares or likes or follows, which can be measured separately and may just also be considered other types of conversions. So we look all this, take it all, put all those different options together and numbers together. And what we do is we combine them with our audience research, knowing who they are and what they care about, and our strategic business objectives, and we get our media plan. This is the combination of all the media channels we'll use across a time period to try and achieve strategic success. You may have even heard the term integrated marketing communications plan, which honestly is a term that's been a little bit blurred out these days. But really, if somebody asks what your integrated marketing communications plan is, what they're asking is how you'll use your budget to mix up various media channels to reach a specific audience for your specific strategic business goals. It's that simple. So now you understand the foundational elements to examine your strategy as a media planner would, but that leaves us with a question. You might be saying to yourself, well, Robert, you said it's fundamentally changed. How has it fundamentally changed? Well, we'll talk about that in just a bit. But for now, what I'd like to do is get on to the next segment of our show. And that, of course, is time for us to go into the field and actually learn how this is really working.